Welcome to the Innovation Show, brought to you by the Kindle Institute, who have just dropped their first edition of their biannual journal. It features a collection of articles from some of the world's most forward thinking executives, policymakers, and academics, designed to help business leaders gain actionable insights and perspectives around things like AI, global trade, and transformation. You can check out the journal and find out more about the Kindle Institute at www.kindle.com/institute. I am delighted to welcome back. You can see the tome of work on the shelves there, and that isn't the half of it. I have gone down so many rabbit holes reading articles, HBR, all types of different journals where he features. But today we're focused on the new release, the updated release of his hit book, Humanocracy. Welcome back, Gary Hamel.
Yeah, pleasure to be back with you, Aidan.
I mentioned going down the rabbit holes. I'm very fortunate to be doing a series on your friend and mentor, Joe Bauer. And I've spent some great hours with Robert Burgelman. And Burgelman worked a lot with Intel, as you know, and wrote a lot about strategy as destiny and how strategy gets stuck and comes up from the bottom. Some great, great concepts coming from there. But it reminded me that the first place I learned about one of the companies you feature as a Humanocracy company was in Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive technology. And this was the mini mills and the company Nucor, which is where I first learned about this. So I'd love you to give us a bit of an introduction there. And by the way, Joe Bauer says hi to you. He said he feels like you're one of his grandkids.
I wish it was a grandkid. Yeah, maybe a nephew. We'll see. But no, happy to chat through that. I guess I'd start by saying, we've really been kind of talking, Aidan, about how our organizations need a pretty fundamental reset. That you know, creating an organization that is up to the challenges that lie ahead is more than a matter of just layering on some new practices. We kind of got to go back to first principles, because in any institution you reach a point where you can't solve the old problems with the new principles, as I've argued, and that's a pretty daunting thing. When you think about kind of DNA level change, changing an organization kind of root and branch, there's good reasons that would be kind of daunting for any leader to think about. And I've argued that there are kind of four things that you need to be able to do that. You need motivation. You need to believe that really we are at a point where more of the same isn't enough. You likewise have to believe that the changes we need are going to have to be deep and systemic. So you have to get to that point where you really don't think there's a viable alternative. And many organizations are not yet at that point. They're still, trying to change around the edges, take out one layer here, do some downsizing there. But the motivation is absolutely critical. And maybe we talk just a little bit about that. Secondly, you need some models. And, even though I've kind of bemoaned the fact that in many organizations, they won't start to change until it's like blindingly obvious and somebody has given you the whole roadmap to do it. I'm also sympathetic that it's really hard to commit yourself to doing something that kind of nobody else has ever done, right? We don't really expect many CEOs to be the Wright brothers and say, let's try something that has never been done before. So you need some models that give you some confidence that, you're not starting down an impossible path. I think thirdly, you need some pretty deep mindset changes, which I think we'll talk about, and changes in perspective. If you don't have that, this is going to stall out, I'm sure. And then finally, you need a migration path from kind of here to there. So even if you have some very compelling models that say, hey, there's a different way to organize human beings at scale. You can build a much more capable organization if you start with a different set of principles. How you go from here to there is a real challenge. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of organizations in our conversation today that were not greenfields, right? These are not companies that got started on this new kind of post-bureaucratic DNA, but they had to make that transition. And maybe if we have time, we'll talk about more than a couple, because I'd like to be able to cover some from different industries, different countries, and so on. But yeah, so that's really what we're talking about today, is like, you've grown up in and around an organization that fits a particular kind of template, that old bureaucratic template. Most leaders have never seen an organization that is different fundamentally from that template. So it's hard to imagine that something might be possible. But let's look at some examples and see whether that's the case or not.
When I first read about Nucor, I mentioned the mini mills and stuff like that. And I just thought it was such a boring example. When I struggled actually when I first read The Innovator's Dilemma, and I struggled about even thinking about these businesses. Also, in Jim Collins' Good to Great, he talked about Ken Iverson, may he rest in peace, the former CEO of Nucor, and he talked about this level 5 leadership. But there, when I read your work, it really brought it to life. It actually gave it a human sense to me, and you also talked about, well, yeah, that's the point here. If you think about a steel mill, you just think about probably the archetype of the industrial revolution. Like if you think about this old school type of factory, heat, sweltering heat, people in hard hats, raw hard work. There's no place there for thinking, there's no place there for autonomy. But you proved that absolutely wrong. And I thought I'd set us up with a quote from the late Iverson, who said, most of today's corporations were conceived as command and control organizations. We built Nucor under the assumption that most of the genius in our organization would be found among the people doing the work. I just thought that was such an incredible thing to say in something like a steel mill. We both work with organizations, Gary, and one of the things that often is said is in a manufacturing type organization, we don't really need innovation, we need execution. And Nucor shows that is absolutely not the case.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Nucor has been a standout company for many decades. So, as you mentioned, many people have written about it and talked about it. Some have kind of emphasized the kind of the strategic angle, like Clay Christensen, and the difference between the mini mills and traditional integrated steel companies, and have argued that Nucor certainly had an economic advantage there, which I think is true, although they have plenty of competition now from other mini mills. Others have emphasized the fact that the company's very good at creating new knowledge, and all of that's true. And then Jim Collins, like level 5 leadership. Yeah, except not the usual kind of level 5 leadership. In fact, if you look at the Collins model, it's a very stratified model of this. At the top of the pyramid, hopefully you have these level 5 leaders. Well, Nucor is the opposite of a stratified model, and Ken Iverson or CEO Sense would never claim to be level 5 leaders. They would claim to be stewards of an organizational culture that encourages innovation at the fringes, but nobody celebrates these CEOs as some kind of extraordinary prescient leaders. They simply have a perspective on human beings. It's interesting talking to some of their former CEOs. One thing that came back again and again was the idea that the company's really in the business of building people. And I may not get this exactly right, but one of the CEOs, John Ferriola, said, we build people because if you build people, you'll have strong communities. And if you have strong communities, you'll have strong companies. And so it's kind of just the opposite of that tendency to look at human beings as resources. And as we've talked about in our series here, one of the most unfortunate legacies of that bureaucratic model is that kind of caste system where the assumption was, the thinkers are at the top and the doers are at the bottom. And that's a legacy of a time when that was probably true, right? Where people on the front lines were not very well educated and so on. But that's certainly not the case anymore. And yet that that prejudice still exists. So you're also right that when you think about a steel mill, you think about, yeah, well, you're going to need people who have like brawn and who are very cognizant of safety, and they're willing to sweat and work hard. But you wouldn't think that kind of imagination and analytical skills and teaming, that these are really fundamental to running a steel mill. It's certainly a daunting, if you've ever been inside one, it's a very daunting place to be. You'll have these enormous uh, urns, I'm not sure what you call it, containers in which they melt scrap metal with 175 megawatt electroshock treatment, and you watch people pouring out streams of molten metal. But at Nucor, it's definitely the expertise of those on the front lines that has made this company what it is. And let me give you an example that is repeated hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times every year. This happened at a plant Nucor runs in Blytheville, Arkansas. Not many of our listeners or viewers have probably ever been to Arkansas, and there's probably no good reason to go. But having said that, a lot of Nucor's plants are in kind of more rural areas. And this is the facility that created the giant I-beams that undergird New York's One World Trade Center. But a few years back, there were crew members, not managers, not engineers, and so on. There's some crew members who realized they were going to have to replace this colossal bowl, the furnace shell where all this stuff gets melted, the metal gets melted. And so they got on airplanes. Again, these are blue collar frontline team members. They got on airplanes. They went out and got bids. They talked to vendors. And I think the cheapest bid was around $30 million. I thought, like, wow, that's too expensive. And of course, at Nucor, your compensation, your bonuses depend on asset productivity. So if you could save some money and not, spend less money on capital, that's a good thing. And blue collar employees understand that, right? Which most blue collar employees don't have that perspective. They have no idea on capital efficiency. So anyway, they're going around the world. They find the lowest bid. And they think, gee, that's too expensive. So they went back. They hired their own metallurgists, consultants, designed their own cauldron, and then went and found fabricators to make it. And in the end, it cost the company $3 million. So, 1/10 of the original bid. And if you multiply that kind of innovation by 100 times, 1,000 times a year, you start to understand why these guys have been the most consistently most profitable steel. So that's just like a little insight. But I think what's useful is to maybe just unpack a few bits of their management model. And I'll try to do this kind of quickly and just a few headlines. But first of all, they run around 70 or 80 steel plants across North America. Each of these plants is an independent business. It has its own P&L. It has virtually no corporate costs allocated to it. At the center, you'll find very few of the traditional corporate functions. I don't think you'll find engineering or sales or HR and so on. All of that is distributed down to these plants. So you really feel like this is my business. And a typical plant will have somewhere between 600 and 1,000 employees. So people feel like they're working in something that feels like it belongs to them. And there are no approval levels except for major capital projects. The firm can pretty much manage its own budget and everything else. So you start there as a very large company that's basically a confederation of relatively medium-sized companies or divisions, number one. Number two, they have a very lean management model. At the center, they have roughly about 100 people at the corporate center, and this is for whatever, like a $30 billion corporation. Within the plants, the average span of control is 1 to about 130, 140 frontline employees. And overall, if you compare Nucor to its global peers, ArcelorMittal and so on, you find it has about a third the number of managers as you typically find in a company of this size. So that would be second. I think thirdly is decision rights. And at Nucor, the frontline teams are kind of ridiculously empowered. They take the lead in setting the production targets, in allocating tasks, in dealing with disciplinary issues, in meeting safety and quality standards. Any team member can issue a purchase order for up to $50,000, which is like unheard of. And let's say a team member needs a new plasma welder. They find the vendor, they specify what they need, they place the order, and there'll be a lot of consultation because you don't want to make a stupid decision, but they really trust the frontline people to make a lot of very, very important decisions. Four, they reward new thinking, they reward innovation. Frontline teams at Nucor are paid about 75% of the industry average, but once a team exceeds a productivity threshold, they start to get a bonus. And basically, if you think about a particular part of the production process, there'll be a rated capacity. Given this many people, this many machines, here's what we expect in tons per hour or whatever that process may be. Well, once you get to kind of 80% of rated capacity, your bonus kicks in and it keeps going up as you get more productive. So every employee has this powerful incentive to sweat the assets. The bonuses go to teams, not to individuals. And with bonuses included, Nucor employees make about 25 or 30% more than the industry average. And that pay gap is complete testimony to the ability of these people to innovate. I was talking again to one of their ex-CEOs, and I said, this is the most innovative steel company in the world year after year. And I said, like, you must have an amazing R&D department. He said, yeah, it's 20,000 people strong. So that comes out of individuals on the front lines. Every plant is accountable for its own growth. And that includes the blue collar employees. If demand slackens, if you lose a big customer for whatever reason, or you're going through a downward business cycle and capacity utilization goes down, that affects everybody's pay. So again, blue collar employees will be on airplanes, they'll be out talking to customers. What else can we do for you? How do we capture more of your business? And so again, everybody here is thinking like a business person. And that's not by accident. When you get them hired by Nucor, you get a lot of training in kind of basic financial literacy and business skills. You'll go through a simulation where, again, a newly hired blue collar employee, you will learn how to run a steel plant where you're running ups and downs through the business cycle. You have to buy energy, you have to hire people, you have to decide on pricing, on capital investment. And again, even though these are so-called blue-collar employees, every employee has a personal development plan that will outline the next 5 to 10 years of their career goals. And that may mean that you move at some point into a supervisory role. It may mean you move into a different department. You want to learn new skills. But, they, in a sense, they treat their employees in the same way. You look at the plant itself, like, how do we just create better, more capable employees? But they trust people to make these decisions because they've invested in building these skills. You don't empower people if you don't believe they have competence. Now, a question I think a lot of people might have is, all right, you have 70, 80 plants running and a very lean head office. Where does the coordination come from? How do you capture the benefits of being a very large company despite being a fraternity of small companies? And that happens almost entirely through lateral coordination. So there's all kinds of things they do to connect these plans together and to make sure you're learning from one another. So every plant gets to see all the financials of every other plant. So when you see a plant that's doing better, that's kind of in your product line area and doing better, what often happens is they create a best marking team. So that might be drawn from several different mills. You send that team into this high performing mill and you look at what they're doing differently, and they codify it, and that gets spread across the organization. So the elapsed time from somebody figuring out something new to that being shared practice across the organization is often measured in weeks. Whereas if some central function had to recognize what was being done differently, had to codify it, had to train people, that might take a very long time. But here there's no up and down. It's just like, a plant to plant. They spend a lot of money building those connections between people across plants. So plant managers are getting together every month. The layer beneath them will be getting together a couple of times a year. And people within particular teams and functions will meet with sister plants. So a lot of, you might think of even overinvestment in building that social capital across the organization, but that becomes the conduit for best practices and knowledge to move very quickly. The plans also collaborate on big new strategic initiatives. I don't think Nucor has like a big top-down strategy, but a plant may see an opportunity, realize it doesn't have enough resources, so you reach out to other plants and you say, how do we collaborate on this? One example, about a decade ago, somebody was asking, why aren't we selling more to the car industry, auto industry? Because most of their steel wasn't actually high enough quality for that application. Very high quality for construction and other things, but not what you need to build an automobile. So 5 plants came together. They divvied up the task of talking to customers, figuring out what was necessary, building technical skills, making plant investments. And that's now about 10% of Nucor's business. And that's happening all the time, right? They're not waiting for somebody from the top to say, here's our strategy. It's, where do we see an opportunity for growth? If I can't do it on my own, who else can help me? Every single person in this company, everyone has the incentive to grow and build a better business. So that's happening all the time. Finally, to support all of this, they have just built a lot of trust with their team members. They have never made a layoff, even though there was a couple of times, I think, during the financial crisis when, in fact, I think only once have they had an unprofitable year, and they would have been profitable if they laid off. No investors pushed them to do this because they understand the value of the continuity and the trust and so on with their employees. When there is a tough time, everybody's salary goes down, the leaders proportionally more, rather than what's typical is we just lay a bunch of frontline people off. Obviously, investing in training, that's a mark of trust. Sharing every bit of financial information openly, that's a mark of trust. So, all the commercial data, bids, orders, pricing, shipments, return on assets, like anything that's relevant to running the business gets shared. So, a lot of the folks I talk to, they describe this as a chain of trust, and not a chain of command, but a chain of trust. So, yeah, that's if businesses that are small and relatively small and independent, very few layers of management, which forces people lower down to build their own managerial capabilities. A lot of empowerment, direct rewards for innovation. When you raise the productivity, that in next week's paycheck, everyone accountability for growth, very deep skills. I mean, all of these things together have just produced a company that, year after year delivers extraordinary results. Their profit margin tends to be 50 or 60% above, 150% of what their peers would be. Their return on capital, the same thing, tends to be from 1.5 to 2 times their peers. Net income per employee, any way you measure it, market value per employee. They just outperform everyone in the industry. And the interesting thing, Aidan, and you'll see here, as I said, Nucor's been around a long time. There's a bank, I don't know if we've talked about, Svenska Handelsbanken in Stockholm, which has for 50 years been the best performing bank in Europe among its peer group. And you look at some of these examples, you're like, okay, these guys have been winning for 30, 40, 50 years. Presumably anybody can, and stuff is written about them. It's not a secret here. So it really becomes interesting, like, why haven't these practices been more widely adapted? That comes back to mindsets and motivation. But certainly you see at Nucor this like super clear model, for how you unleash the everyday genius of these people. You flatten the pyramid. You teach people to think like business people. You give everybody responsibility for a P&L, right? You create these dense lateral networks. Not a mystery, but yet not also a common practice.
Man, great memory and great job. You basically went through all my notes, line by
Okay, well,
line,
sorry.
covering covering that chapter. No, but there's a couple of things. What really struck me, right? So I had the benefit of I listened to the audiobook and I read it, which was great because I got a double whammy, and then I took notes, and then I went. It's interesting when somebody looks at this as a business, they'll go, if they know the literature, they'll go, oh, well, Nucor was a disruptive innovator. That's what they did. They came in at the low end of the market, built capability, and moved up. I'd love you to explain that a little bit. But what I learned from you and from our series was it's more than that. It's also management model or management paradigm innovation, where they not only change how they come in at the lower end of the marketplace, but they change how they actually did things. And it's the combination of those things where people might just go, oh, they were lucky they got in at the low end of the marketplace. It's kind of like Toyota coming in at the low end of the marketplace, but then having a totally different system of how they worked, and the whole productivity system and Kaizen and all that stuff. It's a combination of those things. And as you say, the formula's there. Go and do it.
Yeah, I think, I spent a lot of my life thinking and writing about strategic innovation. We talked about, the book Leading the Revolution. And I wrote a piece called Strategies Revolution, I think, that came out before really almost anybody was talking about this. So I believe that kind of innovations is hugely important. And but what you have to answer is, like, why 40, 50 years later are they still in the lead? I don't know if we've talked about this before, so pardon me if I have, Adam, but I tend to think of innovation as on kind of a scale, or different sorts of innovation, where the bottom you have innovation in maybe products and services, the next new iPhone, or some new financial derivative or whatever. A level up from that, you have innovation in operations. So maybe, 30, 40 years ago, Walmart, like, really learning how to use IT to run this huge supply chain. A level up from that, you have innovation in strategy. Here's a new business model, disruptive innovation, and so on. A level up from that, you have innovation in ecosystems. So you look at some of the Chinese companies like Tencent and so on, or Alibaba, who've built these kind of super apps and so on, or you look at Apple with all its iOS ecosystem. But I think at the top, you have innovation in management and organizations. And those are the source of innovation. I'm pretty sure because we looked at this carefully. These are the sorts of innovation that pay the biggest dividends and also for the longest. Because when you change, if you think leaders are kind of hostage or loyal to an old business model, I can tell you they're a lot more loyal to an old management model. So, particularly one where they're the ones in charge and get most of the emoluments and so on. So, yeah, if you look back at these fundamental shifts in management model, often it is 30, 40, 50 years. And if you go back farther into military history, it often took a century for other armies, navies to figure out like what was different here. So I don't think, you can't probably, many of these stories, you can't boil it down to like one thing. Yeah, there's a lot of, in fact, if you think of Nucor, their management innovation is what has driven an enormous pace of strategic innovation, of operational innovation, of product innovation. And yeah, because the dilemma in so many of these organizations, yeah, you see a company that once they made a big strategy shift, but what's their ability to do it again and again? Right? So Nucor, the mini mills started out, you're using scrap, use lower quality inputs, and you produce kind of, not such high quality steel. And it's the innovation that it took for them to end up competing with the traditional competitors on very high quality steel, that you can put out in 1 millimeter sheets and so on, was like an enormous amount of innovation. So a lot of folks, that invent new business models, yeah, they're in the lead for a while. They never reinvent themselves. They never reinvent the core, and sooner or later, they get preempted by some new competitors. So any one of these things is part of the story, but I think the deepest part of the story here is how they look at human beings. And by the way, when you talk to them, they'll tell you that, right? They'll admit, yeah, we had a great strategy. We had some certain cost advantages, but we've had also a lot of imitators through the years, and we've held on to our lead. In fact, the lead has gotten bigger. So when they tell the story, that's the story they tell, and I'll trust them that they know it's really driving their success.
There was a couple of things you said in that chapter as well, and I highly recommend reading it and the updated version of the book as well, which will release this episode just before it's coming out as well. There's four things you talk about that are humanocracy traits. The first was stratification, then there's standardization, formalization, and finally specialization. And I thought we just mentioned them at a high level from a Nucor lens. So we can talk about stratification, for example, the formal hierarchy, that type of thing.
Yeah, stratification, as I said, they're very flat, very few layers, probably two maybe layers between a frontline employee and the CEO. So super flat. And I will tell you, the I think you could probably measure the effectiveness of any organization using a ratio, or maybe this is how you think about how good they are at using capability. Take a ratio where you have one as the numerator and the number of layers as a denominator. So if you have 8 layers, that's 1/8. So you're probably using 1/8 of your human potential, right? So you got to shrink that. And also, you're not waiting. In fact, I was talking, this is like a weird example, Aidan. So I'm a member of a golf course that recently got acquired by a big golf course operator. So I'm not an equity member. This is just a resort club and you pay and whatever. And they just recently got taken over by a very large operator. And I was asking some of the staff, like, what's changed? One of the first things the guy says, well, I need a new credit card machine here. And in the old days, we would have bought that and I had it with a week. Now it's 3 months of requisitions, approvals, justifications to get a new credit card reader. So I think that, that flat lack of stratification makes it clear to people that you are going to drive the success. It reduces the lags between sense and respond. It forces people to grow up and really use their skills, and rather than like delegating up, somebody else will figure this thing out. So yeah, you see that in spades at Hire.
Just on that point,
Yeah.
there's a lady you quote in the book, Mary Emily Slate, former GM of Hickman Division. She says, the greatest thing is you get it done without somebody from the top saying, this is what you're going to do. And the ideas come from the ground floor. So just on that point of stratification, The next was standardization. Forced standardization chokes off innovation and turns employees into automatons. Everybody knows this. They hate when this happens.
Yeah, well, again, if you look across all these plants at Nucor, there is no standardization, right? Every plant they're all trying to figure out like what's a better way to do things. And they're not following some corporate rule book. But at the same time, as we were talking about, they know whenever somebody has made a fundamental improvement, and they have mechanisms for very quickly disseminating that. So the system is leveling up, it's kind of self-leveling up at a rate that would be impossible if you have a whole lot of formal processes and procedures, and they only get changed once in a long while when it's clearly they're no longer working. So yeah, standardization, I mean, I believe that, in fact, standardization is probably even the wrong way to think about it. The way to think about it is whatever we're doing, we want to do it in the best possible way. And and so I'm going to find out whoever's doing it, and we will, in a sense, standardize around, at least for now, right? We'll standardize. We'll all be doing whatever collectively we've discovered is the one best way. But nobody's setting that up as like that's the way you do it. Hey, that works for now. It works until somebody finds a better way, which a lot of people are working on that. And so, yeah, standardization. I think that's even the wrong way to think about it. You need to think about coordination, homogenization, learning from each other, and you will coalesce. Maybe coalesce is a better word. You will coalesce around the things that produce the best outcomes, but those things don't get turned into standards. They don't get turned into rules. That's just the best way for now. And yeah, so
One of
standardization.
the
Yeah. I
and
mean, by the way,
one
I'll say one thing. I think people gravitate towards standardization because it is the fact that in many organizations, large, particularly global organizations, you'll find people doing things around the world in different ways for no other reason than they've never talked to each other, right? They haven't learned what the best practices are across the organization, or they're just kind of bloody minded and damn it, this is the way we do it in wherever in country X. So I don't want differentiation that is born out of ignorance or out of bloody mindedness, right? If somebody's doing it differently, it has to be they know what all the options are, they've looked at them, and they think that in this particular country, for this particular reason, whatever, there's a reason to do it differently. So I don't want gratuitous differentiation, and I don't want forced standardization. Both of those are like really bad choices. But I think when you look at that problem from the top, you're like, wow, people are doing it all these different ways, and it's clear like these guys are. Well, let's just like make everybody do it the same way. But that's like making every guy buy a 40 regular, suit. Like it's not going to work for most people.
And yeah, these are the things you say that they go against them. So formalization being the next one, like every organization needs a certain amount of structure, boundaries that delineate teams, etc. But Nucor, like Humanocracy companies, is not balkanized. Rather than using corporate staff groups, and one of the things you say is the only two corporate functions are CEO and CFO. That's it across all those companies. So maybe you'll say, so formalization again is something that they avoid and they rely instead on networks, like you said, collaboration.
Yeah. Whenever you start to create formal boundaries, and that's really what we're talking about here, between businesses and functions and so on, you end up with silos and you end up with things that kind of block learning. And worse, people tend to then be loyal within the silo rather than to actually producing business results. I mean, they do have divisions. You can say division 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but there are no silos. As I said, they made this enormous investment in face-to-face communication, also, of course, digital, but face-to-face communication, where people feel like they're a team. So they simultaneously, and again, this is one of those both ands that you're trying to get at. They're very proud about their plan and they're very competitive, right? Everybody likes to be at the top of the league table, and you love to be the one hosting those best marketing visits because everybody's coming to you and saying, "You guys figured this out. This is genius." So there is that, I don't want to call it parochialism, but there's a great sense of pride in what these plants are able to do and in your local facility. But there's also a great sense of collegiality that we're part of this amazing company called Nucor, that it has this amazing model, that we get better at the pace we learn from each other. So there's both a sense of shared identity, but also a sense of local pride. And I think Again, it's easy to have a lot of local pride and ignore everybody else and behave in kind of selfish ways. So balancing that between clear units with clear boundaries, but not impermeable boundaries, where nobody's primary loyalty is to one function or even to one plan. Our loyalty is like, how do we continue to make this the best company in the industry and the best company to work for?
One of the ones that really struck me was you were saying about how they will adopt the technology really quickly because it's in their interest. And I thought about how you think of the Everett Rogers distribution of technologies curve or distribution of innovations curve, that it can be very slow, and how some organizations will take on new technologies really slowly because it's not in their interest to actually do it quickly. And I thought that was a huge thing about this team was if they're bonused on it, the importance of the reward systems. And if the reward systems are not just rewarding the people at the top, but everybody wins.
They have been one of the fastest companies to adopt new technology and automation. And part of that is because they have had a no layoff rule. And they believe that, there's enough opportunity in the world, enough new things they can do, that frontline teams are pushing for the investments in automation where they see it as raising return on assets or return on investment. The frontline employees are pushing, like, why aren't we using this? This can make us more productive. We win more bids, right? And so unlike many organizations where frontline employees are very skeptical of it or resistant of it, and for good reason, frontline employees are the ones who are driving the adoption of new technologies.
And like I was thinking about so many of the cases we talked about, even in military, that they wouldn't change the structures of, when you had a musket versus a bow and arrow. And you won't change it because it probably suits your management style, and the status quo benefits from all this institutional knowledge in the past.
And you have to convince to make that change, you have to convince somebody, often 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 levels up, and to do something fundamentally new that is outside of their experience base, of which they have very little knowledge because they can't know everything. And so the moment you force the moment that the top of the pyramid becomes a rate limiting factor on your capacity to embrace the innovation, you're lost because somebody's going to figure out how to do it faster. And yeah, you can't wait for the CTO or somebody else to say, "Hey, let's go try something new."
One last thing on that, Gary, and the last one, of course, though, is specialization, and I love us to share that as well. But I was working with a financial institution last week, and I was doing a workshop, and I was saying about, for an example, hire. I was saying how decision making is pushed down the organization because it has to be, because of that very point, that by the time it gets approved up the organization, and maybe then with the central regulator, the bank or central bank, that often the advantage has been snafu'd by some upstart, and the resistance is always, oh yeah, but we're highly regulated. And that's a question I always go is like, how do you do that? And all these examples show how you do that, how you push decision making down when there's no massive cost. As in, one of the things you talk about here is nobody's punished for getting it wrong. And with this, if you get it wrong, there's lives at stake.
For sure, in a steel industry, you're dealing with immensely dangerous processes. And so for everybody, safety is a very, very big thing. And it's their lives that are at stake. And so they have safety people on every team. That is also another network where you're sharing what are we learning about keeping people safe. But but your point about failing is a very, very important one. So, for example, at Nucor, if a team thinks we might have a better process or something we need to change, they could actually stop the production process. They can say, "Hey, we need to run an experiment. We're going to take this stuff down, and we're going to see if." Like typically, that would have been a very high level decision to do that because in these kinds of process intensive businesses, trying something new and experimenting, at some point you have to like take down the process and change it and try it and see if it works. So again, John Ferriola, one of the former CEOs, had a very good point on this, and I'll give you as close a direct quote. He said, "You cannot stretch the limits of your knowledge or your imagination if you're afraid to fail." And he said, it's very typical at Nucor to hear a supervisor coaching a new teammate by saying, if you're not failing, you're not pushing the limits of your abilities. And so if you build an organization where like the worst thing that can happen is something goes wrong, you're never going to innovate at this pace. So even in an organization where human lives are at stake, dealing with dangerous processes, yes, there's experimentation. And again, it's not either or. If you have frontline people who are smart about economics, they're smart about safety. They understand we're going to try this, and it may have safety implications, it may have profitability. Like we got to weigh those and make smart decisions. But you're not trying to make those trade-offs at the top.
But to that point, you none of these things work in isolation. So the system needs to change. So that's one of the things I really want to get across is when I ask that question, it's no wonder people get stuck because they're like going, I cannot see a way of changing how decision making is made under the current system or paradigm. Maybe you're able to do it in your own team, but for the organization to change, the systems have to change in that organization.
Yeah, I think, and we'll come back to that maybe when we talk about Roche, but I think it's a super important point. We might have touched on it before, but the dilemma is often when we look at these companies like Nucor or Haier or Svenska Handelsbanken and so on, there's a tendency to glom onto one interesting thing they're doing. Oh, like they train frontline employees to think like business people. Well, that's great. Or they have this like performance bonus system. Like, well, that's interesting. And yet, as you said, Aidan, the success is a system, right? It's a set of things that are mutually reinforcing. Now, those things don't get built overnight, right? You don't design a new system at one go, right? A lot of these things, if you start from the right principle, which in the case of Nucor, as you mentioned, was how do we empower people to drive to build the business and make it better every day. And you start from there. The genius is there, not at the top. Then you keep working that out. Well, how do we make people more capable, give them more skills? How do we give them more decision making freedom? But if you pick out one thing and you try to export that to some other organization, it's not going to have much of an effect. Let me see if I can think of an analogy. If you're a world class athlete like Lindsey Vonn, the skier, let's say, or Michaela Schifrin, now the most winning skier in history, if you only worked on one muscle set, you're not going to be very capable, right? You're working on everything. You're working on your quads. You're working on core. You're working on upper body. You're working on your respiratory capacity. And if you said, "Hey, I'm just going to go to the gym and I'm going to do squats every day forever," like great, but that's not enough. So, and there's always that tendency to like, "Hey, like what's this one magic thing they did that we can just import?" And then like, no, it doesn't work that way. And you also see in all these cases, Aidan, that the journey here is one that is ongoing. It's not like, okay, now we're going to lock down the system. We figured out how to like get the best out of human beings and whatever. Like, okay, that's it. They're constantly experimenting and changing that as well. And so, you look at it at a point in time, and there are two things you don't see. You don't see the evolutionary process, the building, the experimentation, the steps that they went through to get where they are, but neither do you see the kind of fundamental underlying principles that keeps that thing alive and evergreen and growing into the future. You just take one static practice out of context. So yeah, that's not the way to look at these organizations.
And to the guy out there or the girl out there only doing biceps in the gym, we're talking to you. We're talking directly to you. It'll make you look good just when you're wearing that t-shirt, but not on the beach. So work on the entire system. The last one is specialization, Gary, to avoid over specialization. And I was intrigued by this one. Recently, there was a report about swathes of employees being let go in companies like Amazon, for example. P&G was also highlighted, and it was because of AI. And they were like, don't hire for new jobs people that can be trained in the AIs that can be trained in this skill. And the other thing they said, which probably wouldn't have been as noticed as much, was, and Andy Jassy says this, for example, from Amazon, is that now they're hiring and promoting people who have more range in their skills. They have more ability to change across different roles across the organization, which we've been saying for years. But somebody like Nucor actually specifically hires for that people who are broadly skilled, not really deeply skilled in a role. So as you said, there are no slots at Nucor, and thus no artificial limits on where and how teams can contribute.
Yeah, I think Nucor, the primary thing they're getting at in their hiring process is Well, maybe two things. One, does this person have drive, right? Can you tell they've been doing things in their life to try to improve their life, the lives of their family, and so on? But are they interested in? They have some kind of aspiration to be better. And secondly, they will drill down to where have you faced a problem or a conundrum in your life that took creative thinking that you had to solve. So they're looking for drive and for your problem solving capabilities. And I think those are, I mean, yes, there's some level of technical knowledge you need, particularly if you're moving directly into a specialized role. But in general, those are the things that are probably most important to look for and to hire for. I have to say, I'm rather suspicious all these claims that like AI has suddenly proved so effective and invaluable that we're laying off thousands of people. I think it's much more likely to be a fig leaf. I mean, if you look at most of these companies, they dramatically overhired during COVID, and now the environment's becoming tougher. And we're if you've been around for a while, you recognize another round of downsizing for what it is, and don't need like a fancy explanation. But having said that, I'm sure that in over time that's going to be true. It's interesting though. Already we understand that AI is not that good on very specialized things, right? It is kind of a generic thing. New papers out from researchers at Apple and so on showing that AI, it's very hard for it to first recognize a novel problem or solve a novel problem. In other words, something that's fundamentally new for it. So very good at capturing what we already know. Very good at contextualizing that for whatever your role is, whatever question you put to it. But I'm very suspicious that it's going to be able to recognize truly novel problems and develop novel solutions. And at least for some time to come, and depending who you talk to, maybe for a very long time, those are going to be still like our human advantage. And so yeah, but I certainly understand why organizations want to hire people who have generic problem solving skills and a deep sense of drive. Long term, that's way more valuable than a particular set of because even without AI, the rate at which any particular skill set is just becoming irrelevant, the rate of progress, like, yeah, I mean, what even today, if a kid in university, whatever they learned, by the time they show up at an employer, a lot of what they've learned is out of date. So we should probably add a third thing, problem solving, and then just your capacity just to learn, right? And your curiosity and willingness to go like, okay, like there's a better way. And that's something that's ingrained at ingrained at Nucor.
So now from hire, spelled differently, to hire, Haier, and a company that Gary has had a magnificent relationship with over time. I'm also so struck by the humility, the intellectual humility of Zhang Ruman, who is your friend and colleague, I suppose, and how you met him in the early days, Gary, as well. Maybe you'll give us a little bit of context of that. We've mentioned hire so many times and Zhang Ruman throughout this entire series. I'm delighted we're finally here to talk about them and the great culture they have and the great techniques and systems that they have in place.
Yeah, a couple of maybe context setting things. As I think we'll see when we dive in here, this is maybe the most capitalistic organization, I don't know if in the world, but certainly of any I know. And right now, capitalism is, I don't know if I would call it a crisis, but perhaps so, because people rightly around the world see that it is done way better for the few than the many. And so you see across the world kind of ordinary wages stagnant, flatlining, and yet you see stock markets have been up and a huge amount of money going to senior executives, 300, 400 to 1 ratio between CEO pay and frontline employees. And that's going to piss people off and make them suspicious. I mean, there was a survey, I don't remember who ran it, but they asked people around the world, they said, looking at government and looking at business, does it work better for the few or the many? And most people said it works better for the few. So it's a little bit ironic that you would find maybe the most capitalistic company I can find anywhere in China. And my answer to the critics of capitalism is, yeah, a lot of your critique is right on, but the problem is we don't have enough capitalists, right? Yeah, we have some venture capitalists, we have shareholders, but what I want is an organization in which every single individual has a stake in the success of that organization and a meaningful upside, their chance to create value that betters their lives. And if you have any employee who doesn't see that in front of them, and I don't care whether they're working for McDonald's or Ryanair or whatever it is, if they can't imagine a way which they individually and collectively as teams, they can't make the business better and share in those rewards, then capitalism is ultimately, I think, not going to work. It's just and already if you interview kids in the UK, a majority of young people in the UK say they would rather be in a socialist system than a capitalist system. Now, a lot of that is just ignorance because they've never lived in a socialist system. They really don't know what's there. But yeah, so that's, I think, an important context. The other context in terms of like where this idea came from, if you go back 150 years and so on, most people worked in very small organizations, 3 or 4 or 5 employees. Everybody knew who the customer was. Everybody could talk to the boss. Everybody's ideas, at least you could express them and know that you were talking to somebody who could make a decision. Now, many employees will spend their whole career without ever having a one-on-one with the CEO or a key decision maker. So I think a lot of what Zhang wanted to do was go back to that world in which employees felt directly accountable to the users. You and I will both know in many of our customer or our encounters as customers with large organizations, you're not talking to anybody who gives a crap about you or knows anything about you or has any financial stake in solving your problem. And so Zhang said, no, that's not the right way. In a sense, even in a modern economy with these very large institutions, we need employees to earn their living directly from their users. And so the term they have for their model, Renden Hai, is a kind of a mashup of Japanese characters, but it means employee user shared value. That the extent to which you succeed as an employee is going to be measured based on your capacity to create value for the users. And that means every employee needs to have an intimate first person relationship with their users. And we'll see how they do that. But I think those are two very important contextual things. A company that's basically filled with micropreneurs, with mini capitalists, and one that is based on rebuilding and tightening the relationship between the employee and the people they're serving.
One of the things was this shift, like you were saying, making the call. I had this recently with an airline, and I'm like a frequent flyer with this airline, and now I had to change my flight. And like you're saying, I spend a fortune with this airline, and I have loads of points with this airline, and I couldn't get through to anybody that even recognized that. And then I had to actually just go through absolute pain, and I felt like a monolith. And we know this term from monolithic to modular
Mm-hmm.
as a kind of a IT architecture term, where maybe you break up your teams or your IT systems into more controllable pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And what I loved about the higher model is that that's what's happened. It's from monolithic to micro enterprise, and this term ME is really important because it is the building block really of the entire autonomous entrepreneurial cells of hire.
Yeah. So I think, again, this model got built over now maybe close to 20 years, a lot of experiments, things that they tried early on. And I've been connected to this for most of that time frame. Things that worked, the things that didn't work, most were probably in the middle category where they worked but had to be refined. But one of the signature things they did was to break a very large company, I think at the time, maybe 70,000 employees. They broke it down into more than 4,000 micro enterprises. And these are just, as the name suggests, they're fairly small businesses, 15 to 20 employees. And every micro enterprise has its own P&L. And so it really does, it runs as its own business. And every micro enterprise only succeeds by serving real customers. So when they broke the company up this way, even their internal functions like HR got broken up into micro enterprises. I think at one time there were 800 people working at corporate HR, and now there are a dozen. And they didn't fire those people. Most of them went to work in teams focused on training, focused on leader development, and so on hiring and whatever. But everybody now, if you don't find somebody who's willing to buy your services, you go out of business. So there is a deep market discipline there. And I think we've talked about this, Aidan. One of the fundamental problems with bureaucracy is over time, you have a growing proportion of employees who do not report to the ultimate customer. They cannot be fired by the ultimate customer. And and so they're in roles that insulate themselves from the realities of the marketplace. And and it's no wonder that those roles have grown far faster. The administrative roles and managerial roles have grown far faster than other roles because Who's really going to know if I'm in training or I'm in HR, I'm in compliance? Like, who really knows what contribution I am making myself to creating value for customers? So one of the ways they make this real, so all of these micro enterprises are tied together through an internal contracting system. It's based on blockchain technology. So let's say I'm running a little business that is making 3-door refrigerators under one of their brands, and they have multiple brands. But that's my response: 3-door refrigerator under the Casarti brand, whatever it may be. So let's say I need to hire some new skills. I will go to an HR micro enterprise. We will negotiate a contract. They're going to find me 3 people with this particular set of skills. And in that contract, there's a bonus that only gets paid if my products succeed in the marketplace. Similarly, if I want me to build a new sensor in a refrigerator or something else, and I want to build new hinges that make the doors easier to open. I will go to an R&D unit, an engineering unit. I will, and there'll be several of these that will bid for my piece of work, and we will write a contract. But the terms of the contract specify a bonus if that product succeeds in the marketplace. So an individual micro enterprise, particularly the market-facing ones, and they make a distinction between market-facing micro enterprises and what they call nodes, which are other micro enterprises who are selling services to the market-facing micro enterprises. But a market-facing micro enterprise will have a network of nodes, internal nodes that are serving it. And everyone as part of that network is focused on the same result. This product needs to build market share, win with the customers, have few returns, few complaints. And so when you run into a problem, because everybody's bonus is dependent on that, they'll swarm the problem. It's not like, how's that my problem? That's an R&D problem. So no, let's get together and see if we can solve this, because everybody's compensation is tied to making a difference for customers. And you think about, our viewers or listeners, they can ask themselves, what percentage of people in your organization have significant financial rewards that are directly attached to customer impact, customer satisfaction? And in most organizations, that's a super small number. So, so that's, again, a very, very deep principle. Everybody is accountable to customer. And if you don't sell your products and services, you got a business. So I would add to this, every micro enterprise also has very ambitious targets. They call them leading targets. And as you know, in most organizations, people negotiate their targets, businesses negotiate their targets through the annual budgeting process. And, mostly it's relative to like what you did last year. At Hire, they have a team that works from outside in. So they will get data on every product category in every geography and look at, is that growing or not growing? How profitable is that segment? And then you get targets set outside in based on that data as a micro enterprise. And if Hire is in a market where they have a lot of market share, that target may be a little lower. If you're in a segment where you're still gaining market share, that segment may be higher, or that target may be higher. But the target is always a multiple of the underlying growth rate and the underlying profitability. So no one is encouraged to simply keep up with the industry. No one is encouraged to be like same as we did last year, plus or minus a couple of percentage points. So, and that's all tied back to compensation. So they have a baseline target, which is just kind of, you do as good as the industry, and you're going to end up with kind of something close to minimum wage if that's all you do. There's an intermediate target, and then the leading target is probably something that will be you're growing at 5 or 6 times your segment. And to do that, the only way to outperform the segment, the marketplace, is you have to innovate. And so this is also that those leading targets push people to think differently, push innovation, because you can't grow twice as fast as your segment unless you're innovating. And again, compensation highly variable and tied to those leading targets. Now, on more complex opportunities, they have what they call ecosystem communities or micro communities. I won't go too deep here, but again, the question when you divide an organization up into thousands of pieces is like, how do you actually work together? So the contracting system is one way of doing that, and by the way, Hire has that model because they believe markets are way more efficient than hierarchies. That if you're a consumer and you change your preferences, you just buy from somebody else. There's like an instant response to those changes in preferences. So they wanted to create a company where the connection between different pieces of the company was highly malleable and based on contracts, not on, well, you can only buy from us, and this is the only HR provider you have, this is the only IT provider you have, and you're stuck with them. No, everybody is subject to that market discipline. But where you have a bigger opportunity, for example, they recently re-engineered the entire blood supply, medical blood supply in China. And starting from the fact that blood gets stored, gets refrigerated, but then how do we collect it in the right way? How do we get it to the patients who need it when they need it, and so on? And that took dozens of micro enterprises across the company to figure that out. So these ecosystem micro communities, EMCs, somebody sees an opportunity. They say, you know what, we could do something really interesting with the blood supply in China. They post that with an initial sense of what resources are going to be required, what's the economic value of this opportunity, and what different capabilities might be worth. So I need the refrigeration, I need logistics, I need information. And then micro enterprises can bid on being part of that ecosystem. Yeah, I think we could help you do that, and that's going to cost X. So now they have more than 400 of these ecosystem micro communities. And again, I could go much, much deeper on how they work, but I'll just say what they figured out how to do it higher is in an organization that looks entirely fragmented. They've learned how to rapidly reconfigure resources and capabilities as things change. And so resources very quickly move behind the most interesting, exciting new opportunities and away from the things that are not anymore exciting. So you can
I love that.
have autonomy and modularity, as you said, but also immense levels of coordination, but only where you need it and only where it adds value. So I would just say maybe two other things about Hire very quickly. It's a company that wants every employee to feel like an owner, and not because they own like two shares, but an owner in two critical senses. One is your decisions matter. So in a micro enterprise, you are guaranteed three freedoms: the freedom to set strategy, the freedom to hire and fire, and the freedom to share rewards. So that's the most basic notion of what it means to be an entrepreneur. You have freedom to make decisions. And the second most basic thing is you share in the rewards. And so at Hire, through this bonus system, you share in the rewards of your unit. That you can also invest in the capital account of your unit. And if you meet those leading targets over a period of months and quarters, you get a substantial dividend, up to 100% return on the capital investment you make in your micro enterprise. So again, that's why I describe this as like the ultimate capitalist company. Everybody wakes up every day. How do we make this business more successful? How do we create more wealth? Knowing that they will have a share in that. So, and you could argue, it's not a comfortable place for everybody to work. There's not at Hire, like at Nucor, there's not a tolerance for mediocrity. There's no places to hide, including for leaders. If a micro enterprise misses its target for 3 consecutive months, it triggers a new leadership election, and the teams elect their own leaders. And 2/3 vote of the team at any point can depose the leader, because they're not looking for a leader who's nice and fun to work with. They're looking for somebody who will help them meet their leading targets, and they get their bonuses. And you could even do hostile takeovers. So if you see a micro enterprise that's not doing very well, you can go talk to the team, say, I think I could do better. And if the team agrees, you're the new head of that micro enterprise. So yeah, it's evolved over a couple of decades, but it's probably the most radical management model, I think, maybe in the world at that scale. And again, if you look at their growth, growing about twice as fast as peers, their profit growth has been way, way faster than their peers, 3 or 4 times that. Market value for employees higher, shareholder returns have been spectacularly higher. So when you start from the simple premise that we want to create an organization where people are free to achieve, and let's help them do that, like, extraordinary things happen.
It strikes me as kind of like you're supporting entrepreneurial spirit in people, but giving them a kind of slightly a bit of a safety net by giving them systems in place. It's kind of like almost like Jean Ruman's a VC for all these companies, which is incredible. But one of the things that struck me about this, and when I think back over the series and your deep research into all these companies, Gore, for example, there was always huge accountability. You had to show up, you had to do the work. As Jean Ruman said, and you quote him in this chapter, we don't pay employees. They must earn their salary by creating value for customers. So you eat what you kill. So you have to be
Yeah.
delivering, you have to be doing the work. But in there, that sense of contribution, I think people may feel allergic to this, and certainly they're not types of places to hide. There's no hiding in these
No.
places.
But as you say, there's an enormous amount of support. So, you have this network of the nodes and the service providers, who are all super capable and motivated to do the right thing. And Hire's very, very good at creating new ventures. They've created more internally generated unicorns, gazelles, IPOs than I think any company of their size in the world. And if you have a new idea in Hire, they'll introduce you to a venture capital community. Hire typically only invests if a venture capitalist also invests. That's how you know, like, this isn't a stupid idea. You will be able to contract with those internal nodes. One of the problems of a lot of incubators in large companies is if you create an incubator and accelerator, it's not easy for them to access all the capability that's sitting inside of existing businesses. At Hire, I can go to the manufacturing nodes, to the marketing nodes, to whatever, and I can contract to get small amounts of capability to help me build out. So that's just like a ginormous advantage. They have an incredible set of nodes that create customer intelligence. They have the best customer intelligence probably of almost any organization in the world, like just millions of data points of sentiment analysis and other things that are all available for these startups to draw from, and you get a big share of the wealth in whatever you create. One of the most successful, which was not a Hire business at all, but somebody had the idea for creating very, very high powered gaming PCs, laptops. It's now a business called Thunder Robot. It's a unicorn. And so, yeah, so you're exactly right. It ought to be possible to be an entrepreneur within a large company. I mean, why would you ever need to leave if you have all these resources and information and people who are willing to support you? So I think you're right to look at this as a super VC firm where it's not only you get some good coaching and a bit of a network, like you have just a compendium of skills and capabilities around you. And Zhang has often described the company as a platform for entrepreneurship. And I think that's what it is, including in existing businesses, because they do draw a distinction between what they call transforming micro enterprises and entrepreneurial enterprises. So, an entrepreneurial micro enterprise is one that's getting to an entirely different segment, new thing that Hire hasn't done before. Every market facing micro enterprise is considered to be a transforming enterprise. Like you never sit still. And the transformation they've been trying to engineer across all of their legacy businesses is going, first of all, from simply making products for the supply chain, sending out refrigerators, washing machines, and so on, to being on demand. And today, almost everything they can produce within 48 hours from a customer requirement, to turning micro enterprises into their own platforms. And I could give you examples of where that's happened, but where you are now a platform hosting other businesses, participating in that shared value. And they have very detailed ways of measuring every legacy micro enterprise. How quickly are you moving up that chain? And there are incentives to transformation. In most businesses, there's no, maybe at corporate you're talking about this big transformation, but if you're running a business like this, like, there's no pressure to reinvent that thing, right? Until like you're going belly up. But that pressure to move up the value chain, to become a platform company, everybody feels that. So there's entrepreneurship everywhere all the time. And you know, I've argued for most of my career that it was possible to do this. When I first met Zhang, I want to say maybe 2010 or something, he came with a group of his senior folks to my office in California. And we had this like very difficult conversation through translators. It wasn't easy for me. And they had developed all of their own unique language around this. Like there was the terms ZZJYT. What does that mean, right? So you spend an hour understanding like what that language means and how they're using it. But he said, Gary, I read some of your previous books. I read The Future of Management. And you talk about building an organization that's entrepreneurial at its core. You talk about building an organization that's more lateral than vertical. Has anybody ever done this? And I said, no, not to my knowledge. There are little hints of it, but no. He said, we're going to go do it. And so the courage to do that, and also do it in stepwise way, and not blow anything up, and not like bet the farm, but Yeah, it was, and I may have mentioned it in our series, Aidan, but the thing that struck me the most in that first conversation was when he said, "We want everybody to be their own CEO because people are an ends, not a means." And I think we've talked about that, but that's both Nucor and Hire and Svenska Handelsbanken and Birdsong, all the examples in the book. That is where they start from.
Yeah.
That human beings are ends, not means. That what we want to do is remove anything in the organization that is an impediment to achievement, that we want to fully turn on their latent imagination, creativity, and so on. And you look at these things, when you start to look across them, you see a lot of similar. I mean, if you look at Nucor versus Hire versus the other companies individually, you can say, well, that's like super different way of doing this. But if you look at them deeply, more deeply, you see a model that is completely different from the bureaucratic model, where operating units are very small and nimble, where leaders report to the led, not the other way around, where there are very few management layers. At Hire, we took out 12,000 middle managers. Most of them stayed, they're working in other roles, but that role, we didn't need that anymore. The frontline teams are largely self managing. Your influence in the system, because there's little hierarchy, you don't have influence because you have a senior position, you have influence because you have valuable skills. There's a lot of coordination, but it doesn't achieve by steering groups and committees and additional layers. It occurs by connecting people together and by tools like their internal contracting system that make it very easy for people to work with one another. Nobody's competing to climb the pyramid. They're only competing to create more value. And everyone thinks and acts like an owner. So that's the recipe. That's what we're laying out in Humanocracy is, guys, you have the old model, top down, powerful staff groups, compliance is the most important thing. Lots of middle managers assigning tasks, assessing performance, everybody trying to scramble up the greasy pole of the, like, fine. Like, that might have been like the bleeding edge once. It sure as hell is not the bleeding edge now.
There's so much, Gary, in it that I love the serendipity of the show. And now I'm talking to former friends and colleagues of yours with the Burgelmans and the Bowers. I was reading a lot about Intel recently, and I'm really interested in Intel. I was reading Strategy is Destiny, Bob Burgelman's book, and reading elements of the book that he co-authored with Joe Bauer. And there's a part where he interviewed a guy called Frank Gill who ran kind of corporate diversification for Intel. And Andy Grove was an extremely clever guy. As you know, his books are great. He lectured on this stuff. He knew he was
Mm-hmm.
so liable to the foibles of humanity, of the biases we make. And he still hired this guy to look at diversification of their portfolio. And the guy, and he says to him, so this is Andy Grove says to this guy, Frank Hill, Frank, I make $1 billion in profit per quarter. You make $1 billion in revenue per year. You are a distraction. And I was thinking deeply about that. I was like, going, the humanocracy, this model, and the model of Hire, for example, in particular, solves for that value network problem that Clay Christensen used to talk about. Is that if I'm making all this money, anything that's a distraction from making that money, what Andy Grove called job one, is such a big problem. But if I'm willing to back stuff, and then I have this team that are looking at the data and go, actually, Aidan's onto something here, it removes all the human biases from the playing field and allows me get onto the pitch.
No, I had the same experience with Intel. I spent a lot of time with them a couple of decades back and talked to to senior teams and at events and so on. And I had the same conversation. I don't remember who it was in any group, but some senior person said, "Hey, yeah, we want to innovate and we want to look at new opportunities, but we don't want to we don't want to look at anything that's not at least $1 billion in revenue." And I said, like, well, how would you know something is a sure thing, $1 billion in revenue? Only if somebody else has already done it. By which point it may be too late to catch up. And so I would argue Intel, and again, I don't want to represent Bob Bergelman's work. I know he did a lot of research looking at how the company made the transition from RAM, which is becoming a complete commodity, random access memory, to microprocessors, which is a very new thing. And Intel basically invented the world's first, microprocessor. And again, that started relatively low in the organization. We've talked about this before. wasn't really endorsed by top team to beginning, but it seemed to have real promise. And like, through a whole set of happy accidents, it becomes like, yeah, we should do this. Well, is that what I want to rely on for the future of my business? That like we just happen to have somebody down there who's thinking about this thing and happens to make some progress and capture somebody's attention, and you happen to have a senior leader who's like open to that idea and whatever. Like that's the most kind of risky and probable. And so Bergman rightly described how new strategies get built, often in companies, which is serendipitously and bottom up and so on. But yeah, okay, fine. That's how it happens. That's not how it should happen. How it should happen is we have a system like at Hire where we've incentivized every single person to be constantly exploring the future. I think one outside observer described Nucor as basically, a group of people who are swarming the future. And you don't know where exactly the profit is out there, but you're going to find it because you just have like enough people at very low cost who are out there thinking about where it might be and who have an incentive to build it, and who find it very easy, relatively to most companies, finds it very easy to get a small amount of funding and some resources to get something started. Intel didn't have any of that. And you go back and you look at their history. The company right now is a shadow of its former self. It's lost more than half of its value. I think at the moment, unless I'm wrong, it's worth less than book value. They recently had another CEO change. Pat Geisinger was forced out. Over 20 years, they fumbled every single industry shift, every single one. In 2005, they turned down the opportunity to buy NVIDIA for $20 billion. Right now, one of the most valuable companies in the world. In 2006-07, they turned down the opportunity to make chips for the iPhone, which I think we talked about. And now these mobile optimized devices outsell x86 chips 10 to 1 and are almost they turned down the opportunity to separate out design and manufacturing and become a foundry that just makes chips for anybody because they had the best process technology in the world. But the marketing people, they wanted to hold that foundry capability like, no, we're like, don't give anybody else that capability. Well, if you're not producing enough chips and you lose just the volume to somebody else, you're going to lose your process leadership, your manufacturing leadership. So, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, ends up as by far the largest, most productive, and is now worth, I'm going to guess, at probably at least 5 times what Intel is worth. And, if you talk to people that were Intel over those years, and you talk to some of the board members, they're going to tell you the blame lies entirely with just the inexorable growth of bureaucracy. And when Andy Grove left, the next several CEOs, Paul Otellini, Brian, I think his name was Krasinich, Bob Swan, these guys were either marketers or finance people, right? They were not engineers. And so you just have this slow acceleration of bureaucratic toxins over time. And and the current, I'm trying to think of who's the guy, Lip Bhutan, who's now, I think, the CEO. He was on the board, now maybe acting CEO. Direct quote, he said, the company was overrun by bureaucratic layers of middle managers who impeded progress. And somebody else called Intel the largest single-celled organism in the world, right? One way of thinking, one way of doing things, and whatever. And to make matters worse, Aidan, between 2010 and about, I don't know, maybe 2019, 2020, something in that, but for more than a decade, the company spent more on buying back its own shares than it spent on R&D R&D or capital equipment. It's like unbelievable. In a world where this opportunity is almost unfathomable, you're taking most of your 136 billion, whatever it was, of free cash flow over that period, and you're giving it back to shareholders. Like as if you can buy,
That's what I love about these examples is that if you go, whatever about that humanocracy stuff, that's all fluffy. You go, it solves for the innovator's dilemma. It solves for the problem of hyper focus, which is what Andy Grove did. He hyper focused, and even at the cost of what I talked about, Bob Bergman, was they had an early version ahead of Cisco of teleconferencing, but it wasn't making money. They were like going, there's all the money's to be made in microprocessors. Let's hyper focus there. And focus means saying no. This, particularly Hire, solves for that problem where it's going, we know there's a growth here, there's an opportunity here. We have these analysts, they're looking at the data, and I put all these systems together to go, we're like this unbelievable VC that can back loads of opportunities. And kind of like Jeff Bezos talks about, even if some of them come in, we're going to be unicorn business and we're going to keep
Mhm.
surviving all these shifts in technology, etc. That's what I love about this book, and how for me it's just the culmination of all the stuff I've read in your work. And also I can see the progression of you having that moment where you're like going, actually the management model innovation is such a key part of this that's so often overlooked. And that's what I love about having done this series with you.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, I have never been a fan of the term disruptive innovation. And at the same time, I've argued for years and years that it's the newcomers. Historically, we've created a lot of the new market value. I talk about being an industry revolutionary. I'm happy to talk about creative destruction and so on. The problem that I have with disruptive change is the very term puts you on the defensive. Like, disruptive to what? So it starts premises, and I know that premise is true in maybe an empirical way, but it's not the right way to think. And so we're reinforcing bad thinking because what you're saying is it's disruptive. Well, disruptive to what? Disruptive to the legacy. All right, so why is that what you're focused on? Like, why aren't you opportunity driven? And the reality is, and I don't know if anybody's really done this analysis deeply, but the reality is most of these new technologies and most business models, they did not kill the old thing. I mean, they shrunk it, right? But the new thing, I mean, what's the value of of Amazon's online book sales, right, versus the rest of the industry? It was hugely big, hugely valuable. Look at the value of the companies, TSMC and Qualcomm and so on, that were designing chips for mobile devices, worth way more than Intel is worth. The idea that the real problem is that this is going to gore the ox you have, bullshit. Not right away. It's going to take time. The transition from film to digital took quite a long time, decades. It's not going to happen right away. You have plenty of time to respond. So the idea of like instant cannibalization, that doesn't happen. The idea that the new thing is going to be fundamentally less profitable than the old thing, not usually the case. The new thing is usually, why does it take over? Because it's bigger, right? And what is often the case is the margins are lower. So if you build a fat business and you're used to operating like Intel with 60, 70% gross margins, and now you have to do 30, well, okay, yeah, that's something. But let's look at the volume side of it and look at what's the net profit potential. So the problem isn't that you have, that these new things undermine the old thing, they instantly cannibalize it, they're going to be worth less. Not at all. So it's not really a disruptive thing. It's the problem, and I would even argue the problem is not leaders who are holding on to the past. The problem is leaders who are not spending enough time thinking about the future. And if you're not doing that, I use this analogy. If you don't see the birds in the bush and all you have is the bird in the hand, you go like, damn it, this is my bird. It's a lovely bird. The feathers are falling off, but like, I know this bird, it's my bird. Like, fine. But there shouldn't be some like deep dilemma, to use that word. There's not a dilemma. There's not a dilemma. The new thing is going to be bigger. It's going to be more profitable. It's going to be better. And the only question is like, when do you start building it? Like, do you wait until somebody else has done it, or do you see it early? Do you experiment like hires across a broad front? And are you essentially an opportunity-driven company? Yeah, I don't see the dilemma there. There's a problem there, but there's no dilemma.
Man, I've a terrible mind. I'm thinking of the scene from Dumb and Dumber. Pretty bird, pretty bird. Gary, Gary, always a great pleasure. A lovely way to finish. I'm left with the idea of the bird, the bird in the hand that's like half dead. We talked about it before, and you're still feeding and the things like, or else it's on life support and you're trying to keep it alive as well. There's a website that goes with Humanocracy as well. There's loads of resources, Gary. Let's share where people can reach out and find them.
Yeah, at humanocracy.com, you find a bit more about the book. You can, be in touch with me, GaryHamel.com. And then, please, if you're listening to this and you have a question or an observation, share something from your own experience. If you have like a experience of bureaucratic insanity with your own company or something missing the future or just a question, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I try to be quite responsive there. You can follow me on X as well. But if you want to like have a conversation or check in with me on something, LinkedIn is maybe the best way to do that.
You're going to be inundated with people, bureaucracy, Gary. And we're going to be back again. We're going to do another part. We're going to cover Roche in particular, which is a great case of reinvention and bringing these to a traditionally very bureaucratic industry in pharma. So we're going to talk about Roche, which is be a great case study.
Your point.
Sorry.
If somebody's saying we can't do any of this because we're a highly regulated industry, nonsense. We'll look at Roche.
We'll talk about Roche on Humanocracy Part 3. Author of Humanocracy, Gary Hamel, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure as always, Aidan.
Thanks once again to our sponsor, Kindle. You can find Kindle's brand new journal biannual release that features the world's top thought leaders on policy, on AI, on many technological shifts. And you can find that at www.kindle.com/institute.